Sometimes all it takes is a single event, one plane landing on one runway, to show you just how much the world is changing. Today, we're going to break down how one Russian aid shipment to Lebanon became this huge geopolitical signal, really challenging America's long-held influence in the Middle East. Okay, so let's set the scene. We're at Beirut's International Airport. It's super close to Israel's northern border, which is important. And down comes this massive Russian Ilyushin IL-76 military transport plane. Now, this was no ordinary flight. This thing was personally authorized by Vladimir Putin himself. So what's the deal here? I mean, on the surface, sure, it's a humanitarian mission. But the source material we're digging into today says, hold on, there's way more to it. This was a calculated move. It was designed to send a crystal clear message about who has influence, who's showing leadership, and how the old rules just might not apply anymore. All right, let's get right into the nuts and bolts of this mission. We're going to look at what was actually on the plane, the controversy that blew up almost immediately, and how Russia, honestly, just played this whole thing incredibly efficiently. So the cargo manifest was pretty straightforward. 27 tons of essential humanitarian supplies. We're talking about the absolute basics you would need to survive. Generators to get the lights on, food, shelter, all things that the people in Lebanon were desperate for as this crisis was unfolding. And this is where things get messy. As soon as the plane landed, suspicions started flying. Western governments were hinting that this aid could just be a cover, for shipping weapons to Iranian-backed groups. But here's the thing the source makes very clear. The accusations were made, Russia flat out denied them, and to this day, no actual proof has ever surfaced. And get this, the mission was a 2-for-1 deal. After dropping off those 27 tons of aid, the plane didn't just fly back empty. Nope, it picked up Russian citizens and their families who were stuck in Lebanon and took them home. It's that kind of purposeful, efficient logistics that screams political will and readiness. Now, to really get why this one plane load of aid made such a huge splash, we have to zoom out a bit. The source argues that this wasn't just a response to a random crisis. It was a direct counter to a deliberate and pretty brutal strategy being used in the region. The source calls it the weaponization of deprivation. I mean, think about that phrase. The idea is to make life so unbearable for regular people by cutting off power, food, medicine, you name it, that they have no choice but to give in to political demands, or just suffer quietly. And the argument is, this playbook has been used in both Lebanon and Gaza. And the human cost of this, it's just staggering. According to UN corroborated figures that our source points to, the conflict in southern Lebanon has resulted in over 2,200 deaths and more than 7,500 people injured in just a matter of months. Those numbers really put into perspective the crisis that this Russian plane flew right into. And here's where you see this really stark contrast. The source points out that while the very wealthy Gulf Arab states and the EU were busy issuing statements of concern, Russia just acted. Russia was the one who sent the plane. And in doing so, it highlighted what our source calls a total leadership vacuum from the usual players. And that idea of a leadership vacuum brings us right to a major critique of the American diplomatic effort in the Middle East, with a laser focus on its point man at the time, Jared Kushner. The source basically asks, how could Kushner possibly be an impartial mediator? It points to his really deep personal and family ties to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. This quote here refers to a story that Kushner once gave up his own bed for Netanyahu during a visit. And the source uses that as a symbol of a relationship that's just way too close for someone who's supposed to be a neutral referee. But the concerns went way beyond just personal friendships. The U.S. Congress actually launched an investigation into whether Kushner was using his official government job to try and get billions in funding for his private businesses. I mean, the source argues this is a massive conflict of interest that could totally corrupt the entire diplomatic mission. So now let's zoom out one more time, because the source connects what happened in the Middle East to what it sees as a much bigger, more systemic issue with American foreign policy. And the key idea here is something called strategic incoherence. Now, this isn't about not having enough tanks or jets. The argument is that the U.S. has sort of willingly given up its moral high ground and its diplomatic authority, and that creates a void, a vacuum, that allows rivals like Russia to just step right in and grab influence, not because they're stronger, but because they're simply there, when the U.S. seems to be missing in action. And the source claims this isn't a one-off. It points to a global pattern. The strategy of deprivation in Lebanon is put side by side with the 60-year U.S. blockade of Cuba.
In both situations, the argument goes the policy led to incredible hardship for civilians. And in both situations, Russia stepped in with aid for Lebanon and fuel for Cuba, directly poking the U.S. in the eye.
You know, the source argues this is actually a huge departure from the founding ideas of American foreign policy. It draws a straight line from George Washington's famous warning against getting too attached to other nations to the situation today. The suggestion is that this lack of impartiality has clouded America's judgment and hurt its own interests. And all of this brings us to the source's main point, a conclusion that it admits is really challenging, especially if you're a big believer in the Western democratic model. The source is very blunt about this. Russia's motives were almost definitely self-serving, to gain influence, to make the US look bad, sure. But it argues you have to separate the why from the what. And the undeniable fact on the ground was that 27 tons of aid, generators, food, tents, got to people who were absolutely desperate for it. So we end up with this really provocative question. When a crisis hits, when people are suffering, who actually shows up to defend human dignity? The source says that question isn't answered by what a country says it believes or what its ideology is. It's answered by what it actually does. So, in this specific case in Lebanon, the source concludes that the uncomfortable answer was Russia. Now, the point here isn't to celebrate Russia's government, not at all. It's meant as a direct challenge to the US and its allies. It's asking a really tough question. How did we get to a place where a strategic rival was the one taking real, concrete humanitarian action, while we were, as the source puts it, still writing our statements of concern? And that's the question we're left with.